We have pulled our morning speakers aside to do a little press conference. We have some on-site print and television media here, and we have some folks on the phone, and we are streaming this press conference as well as part of our ongoing drought management webinar series for the Southern Great Plains, run by the Southern Climate Impacts Planning Program out of the University of Oklahoma and Louisiana State University. So appreciate those folks being a part of this as well. For those who are on the call who are not part or have not been on any of those webinars before, we invite you to register for them. They're held every other week, and you can register at southernclimate.org. That's SCIPP's website. Feel free to sign up and get notices of these webinars and participate in the future. Before we get started, we'd like to do a quick call of media who are on the phone. If we have any media contacts on the line, if you could please introduce yourself and your affiliation, that would be great.
John Rigg, Levelland News Press.
Thanks, John.
Lauren Morello with Climate Wire.
Hi, Lauren. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Any other media contacts on the line? Great. Well, what we're going to do is have a very brief introductory statement from each of our three morning speakers, just for 1 or 2 minutes, summarizing what they presented here this morning, and then we'll open up for questions both in the room and on the phone. First up is Victor Murphy, meteorologist with the National Weather Service in Fort Worth, Texas. Victor?
Thank you, Dave. Basically, the Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico region had either the most intense or second most intense drought on record for the period ending in late 2011. Certain portions of the region have seen some significant improvement in early 2012. That would be mainly eastern Texas and the eastern two. However, deep South Texas and most of West Texas, including the Panhandle, and most improvement. Any improvement the next few months should be very significant with regards to seeing any future improvement, since that is the wettest time of the year. May into June, July is the wettest time of the year in Western Texas, and the summer monsoon period from July wettest time of the year for New Mexico. So if there will be any significant improvement in the West Texas area and the New Mexico area, it should be within the next 3 to 4. West Texas probably by the end of July. For New Mexico, no improvement by that point in time. The drought will continue. The biggest concern right now is reservoir levels, water levels in some of the area reservoirs. East Texas, with a significant improvement, there's been water levels right now, reservoir levels are near 100%. However, a different story in West Texas. Many reservoirs in the San Angelo area, 0% of basal level. And absent some improvement here in the next 2 to 3 months.
Thanks very much, Victor. Appreciate that. Our second speaker in the morning was David DuBois, state climatologist for New Mexico at New Mexico State University. David, you want to have a comment?
Sure. I gave a talk earlier today on some of the impacts of the drought on the Southern Great Talk. Where I'm just looking at the about the reservoir levels, and in New Mexico. So I look a lot with the snowpack from the southern Colorado and then northern New Mexico, and how that of southern New Mexico. Earlier in April, we've been looking at the stream flow forecast, and they were predicting not a good picture for stream flow for this to the reservoirs for agriculture. Last year's continuing. A lot of the snowpack and in the northern part of the state out very quickly. In some places, not a good sign. And I also talked about some of the other impacts, like with the cattle industry. I guess jokes about some of the decline in cattle numbers, comparing that to the past. You know, last year from 2010 to 2011, most number of exports out of the, at least for domestic, which makes sense with the costs and the problems that we're seeing throughout the southern Great Plains. So I mean, there's been a lot of other things, but a lot of other impacts. So I'll let.
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. Then our final speaker for the morning outlook was Klaus Wolter with NOAA's Earth System Research Lab and the University of Colorado in Boulder. Klaus?
Yes, so I talked about two things mainly. One was the role of ENSO or El Nino La Nina on droughts, and Texas in particular tends to worse droughts when you have a La Nina situation. So surprise at what we have seen so far. However, during the summer, that link is much weaker, and it's actually quite interesting. This year, we are very clearly heading out of La Nina, at least for the summer. If we were to stay just neutral and not go any further, that often has been associated with lingering drought conditions, especially southern Texas. If we were to actually make it all the way into an El Nino, and I would say the odds for that are less than 50%, but there may be 30 or week to week. We look at this because it has been so long. There's a decent chance, I would call it, for an El Nino this summer. That would really improve a lot, especially in New Mexico. New Mexico would do a lot better with I talked a little bit also about other factors like the warm Gulf of Mexico. The good news here is that we have some indications that Western Texas, which has been winter, might see some relief here when it could make a big difference. Odds for this are not overwhelming, but there's a slight tilt in the odds for that. And then the final point in my presentation was that when you have a 2-year La Nina event, there is a slightly increased chance of coming back for a 3rd-year La Nina. Officially, the Prediction Center is saying that we're expecting slightly higher, and that's a significant risk. If we were to go back to a La Nina historically, for a 3rd-year La Nina, some of the biggest droughts on record have been associated with such events. So that's just this big concern, and we're monitoring the situation, and I would say within the next 2 months, we're sure which way it's going to go. If we actually make it to El Nino this summer, we have never gone back to a La Nina within the next 6 months.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Appreciate it. So at this point, we'll open up for questions from the media, and I think we'll start with the two folks on the phone. John or Lauren, do you have any questions for our speakers?
Everything's in flux. I don't know, any advice for producers how they might mitigate the drought if it does persist into the summer?
Dave DuBois will take that one.
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, a lot of what I've talked at a couple of places where we had that. These guys already know what's best. They've been through this. Some of it do, and you know, with moving cattle from different locations and costs and the feed costs, you know, that's a highly variable. there's no magic answer. Hard for everybody, and being better in the future. I think this whole
Victor, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I
to
would
that?
add, honestly, the USDA has in place a new or a good USDA risk management agency (RMA) has in place a new pilot program for pasture, rangeland, and forage producers, in which they can insure themselves or purchase insurance through through RMA or through through insurance agents. And the RMA basically underwrites the risk, but the risk can be mitigated by producers by perhaps looking into purchasing this U.S. Department of Agriculture RMA Risk Management Agency PRF Pasture Rangeland Forage Insurance.
Thanks, Victor, and thanks, David. I'll say a question from within the room here. Betsy Blaney with the Associated Press.
Yes, Klaus, you mentioned near the end of your, if El Nino had not shown up by, I mean, if El Nino shows up by July, we're probably going to have a La Nina, no La Nina in the winter time. But if we don't, then watch out. Does that mean that if we don't see El Nino by July, that
No, that's not quite that simple, because sometimes we have had cases where fall before deciding. So there are basically three scenarios. One is we go into El Nino early summer, and that would bring immediate relief to much of the Southwest. If we just go neutral by the summer, there is still a chance that we could go into an El Nino by the fall. For example, for this happened in 2006. Though spring is sort of a traditional season when we think of these events, years, it can also happen in the fall. In the fall, then there's no way in hell you could go to El Nino by the winter. What I was saying otherwise was that if we go to El Nino by, say, June or July, last 60 years, and I have to double check this for the previous record, I have data back to 1860. There's not a single case I could find where it. I've seen cases where an El Nino develops and then ends prematurely. For instance, in the early 50s, 1951 was one of them, and it lived for about 4 to 5 months. That winter of 51, 52.
Yeah, in your earlier presentation, you said that last week the chances of El Nino coming back. Right now, you're thinking 30%.
Yes.
Why has that changed?
I was looking, and this gets into this more complicated matter of what happens in the tropics on a weekly basis. And we keep, there's actually a weekly conference call that CPC hosts, Time Prediction Center hosts, that discuss. We had a very big intra-seasonal oscillation, very big disturbance in the tropics that moves around the equator about once every 2 months. And for instance, in 2010-11, they were very weak. They hardly were a factor at all. This winter, we've had a couple of these already that had a big imprint. You could actually argue that some of the really wet spells we had this winter in the south were associated with those maddening. And we had just one come through that was very big, had a profound impact, but then just before it sort of finished its footprint, it curled its toes, if you will. It actually did something pretty weird in the Western Pacific. And so it didn't quite deliver the full punch. I called it like a left. So now we're getting ready for the second punch, because this big one that came around is still there, and it's still slightly enhanced compared to but in the last week it has weakened, and so that's my concern right now. If because it's coming around, if it were to strengthen again within the next 2 weeks, it could really reinforce this. Most of the models, most of the dynamical models that we look at, still have it in their initial conditions, we call it. Basically, they take a snapshot. Favorable that this event reinforce their transition into El Nino. Certainty has gone a bit bigger, I would say, just in the last week.
That you feel
You're trying to trap me. Ask me again in 2 months. Right now, if I had to bet, and I sometimes go to Las Vegas, I would say I would definitely hedge still towards a La Nina, but I would have sort of a conditional. I want to see first what happens in the next 2 months.
Thanks, Klaus. Thanks, Betsy. There's another question from within the room.
Whatever conditions.
The question was about the importance of water conservation. I don't know who wants to take that.
Well, I would just say I'm from Colorado, and in Colorado, we had our big drought on record was the one from 2000. Basically, we had to learn the hard way to conserve water, and for water, for instance, recorded a reduction. Partially because of course they raised the rates, and then there was this little circle going on because people had to pay more for water. They conserved even more, so they kind of overshot. And it's an intricate game of dancing around this. But what is really interesting for the last 10 years, everybody thought that after a few years when the drought was over, people would just go back to their old ways. Well, not quite so. People did install low flush toilet, and they are zero-escaping now. So overall water consumption has, unfortunately, since Colorado was such a state with a large influx of people, this is sort of one of these unintended consequences that all of a sudden we have maybe that's just an editorial comment. But in general, obviously, it is very, there's no reason why we should consume as much water. Europe, there are very civilized countries in Europe that get a lot. There are ways to reduce water consumption. The thing you have to worry about is if you have, say, toilets, you have ended up with more concentrated wastewater. So you have to sort of plan for that maybe your sewage.
Let's go back to the phone. A question from John or Lauren? Okay, no questions from the phone. Other questions in the room?
Okay, relatively speaking, this is obviously something that there's at numerous different droughts. How serious is this one compared to maybe other ones that you've seen throughout the years?
Presentation. For Texas and New Mexico, this was the most. We have data that goes back to 1895, solid data back. This was appeared roughly from late 2010 into the most intense one-year drought on second most intense for Oklahoma. So very serious. From a longer-term perspective, the drought of records for these areas is still pretty much. Big issue is, will this drought linger? Like Klaus, if we do get a third-year La Nina, like 50s, the tendency, the probabilities for this drought lingering would increase to more severe due to the fact it would be more prolonged. One-year drought, I think most water systems, as we saw, can pretty much handle that. Have a few little isolated small towns in Texas was able to handle it. East Texas now is in pretty good shape. Eastern Oklahoma if we do get a third-year La Nina, if drought does prolong. The area around San Angelo right now, a lot of the reservoirs near San Angelo are 0% capacity. It has about 15 to 18 months of water supply. San Angelo is a big city. It's over 100. Nowhere in the world you're gonna truck water. Some of these smaller towns around the water, they're gonna truck water. Nowhere in the world you'll be able to truck water. So, I think they're working feverishly right now to start building a pipeline. The concern is there. If we do get the third-year La Nina, I think the concern will be even heightened even more.
So we do see that third year La Nina come in or not come in, is there if relief is going to?
So I think we'll by July or so, we'll have a good feeling, a good inclination as whether or not we'll have relief. El Nino is in place by the end of summer. Region-wide relief. If the El Nino conditions are not in place by July, then the threat.
Just one comment in addition. I said this environmental, of course, but looked at various indicators and they all agree. Here, when Western Texas tends to be wettest on at least near normal, if not slightly. So there is a little bit of relief underway, even if there's El Nino. This is not a slam dunk though, and especially when you have a severe drought, there are other feedbacks that go on. It's a little bit harder if it's really dry around you to import moisture. We saw this in 2002 in Colorado. We get these upslope events on the Front Range. Then 2002 was so dry east of us, even in Kansas, that it would take twice as long as normal. We ended up with much less water. So that's something to be aware of, that it's not easy to get out of a drought. The only slam dunk way or the only fast way to get out of a drought is to get a hurricane make landfall. And I looked at this last year, it's a very localized relief, and sometimes you go straight from drought to flooding, but it's not something you can count on. And we can hardly predict hurricanes in general, but to predict a season in advance where they make landfall, we're a long ways off from that. So that's why I don't usually comment on that.
Question from Betsy.
Yeah, Klaus, the first year of this La Nina was very intense. The return, the second, less intense. What were you saying historically shows third year La Ninas?
Oh, I'm more interested in what the impact is. Sometimes you can get a La Nina that's not so strong, but still has very typical impacts. In fact, one thing that's really interesting about the Texas region is that since the late 90s, Texas has been incredibly consistent in being wet with La Nina, with El Nino in the winter, and dry with La Nina. And that's why it was actually a bit of a surprise how much we departed. The eastern half of Texas and Oklahoma were a lot wetter than is typical for La Nina. And the previous 8 events since the late 90s of either El Nino or La Nina type had always been perfect in terms of being wet or dry phases. I've just found that of those 4 historical cases since 1906 that have had third-year La Nina, 3 out of 4 of those were quite severely dry in the third year. None of them was wet. So the concern, and it's independent, and one of those cases For instance, 2001, third-year La Nina winter was the weakest of the three in a row. The 1 year where it wasn't that severe was the mid-70s, 73, 74 through 75, 76. And what was interesting about that La Nina was that the North Atlantic was on the positive side in North Atlantic oscillation. And that tends to weaken the impact of La Nina. Whereas, in the 2002, it was more neutral and back. So basically, there's many other factors that influence this. And just because if we could predict that this La Nina, if it were to come back, would be on the strong side or on the weak side, that wouldn't guarantee that the impact would be equally strong. The system is not that simple.
Question in the back of the room.
Yes.
Question is to clarify the current ENSO conditions.
Yeah, I was talking about this, that we basically had another La Nina winter, so we had the second year La Nina, what I call it. And we're basically coming out of it right now. We are technically still, and officially, the United States is still saying that we are in a La Nina. Australia has just called it off. So there's some disagreement among different national weather systems. Say within a month, I would be very. There's no indicator right now saying that we are in an El Nino. There is the possibility, if that second intraseasonal oscillation comes around and delivers its right hook, that we could go very quickly into an El Nino. This is the time of year when it can happen very quickly. That's what happened in 2009, for instance.
And
Oh, it's a fairly it's not, I don't want to say it's not totally independent, but it's very removed. It's in the North Atlantic compared to the tropical Pacific, and there's some communication there, and it actually happens often during this time of the year, but it's still very weak. So the North Atlantic basically does its own thing. A lot of research going on to what extent it's influenced, for instance, by the lack of sea ice and various other things. So that's a very active research area, but right now we're not. Winter, it was mostly positive. La Nina winters with positive and negative.
Question was, is cloud seeding still an option?
Cloud seeding is always an option if you want to throw away your money, but if you don't, and it supports an industry. There's a very active, all joking aside, there's a very active program in the Western US, and there's some evidence that it does help with winter storms. So if you have mountains poking into the atmosphere and you have westerly wind flows, you don't need a particularly strong storm to still make it snow. And so they have been doing this for quite a few years. Vail Ski Resorts has been doing it for over 40 years, so track record, but it's all private industry, so there's no easy independent evaluation. But the people are doing a claim about a 10% increase for vegetation. I don't think there's any evidence for a summertime enhancement. My understanding is that it's mostly a winter time. You have cloud, you don't fly an airplane. It's way too expensive. You have some cannons with silver iodide. It's done all across the West, and the only place where it really doesn't work is where it's really polluted. So
one second. Any other questions from the phone? We have a couple more here in the room, but any questions on the phone?
Yeah, this is Lauren Morella with ClimateWire. So I think somebody said at the beginning that there's potential over the next few months for significant improvement, given that this is the rainiest time of year. But I'm just wondering, if you get average rainfall this year, how far does that go towards easing, say, western Texas and the parts of New Mexico that are really hard hit out of this drought?
I think it would lead to, minimal improvement. For example, I think that, the agriculture, dryland farmers should be able to at least get a crop this year, which they weren't able to do last year. So in the short term, I think should we do some limping along. So we won't have the big agricultural losses. We won't have the big wildfire losses like we had. I don't think that would be. It would probably stabilize for a very short period of time, perhaps the water supply situation. But then I think longer term, hydrology and water supply is usually the last sector to go into a drought and the last sector to come out of a drought or improve. I don't think for the longer term, if we had average rainfall, say through May or June or July even, I don't think it would do any significant long-term improvement. A lot of water management agencies will still be, sort of tap dancing.
It's going to take more than just one good season of precipitation for this to occur, and several good snowpacks, several good monsoons, several years. I think that's then we'll start. Areas, but yeah.
Thanks, Lauren. And that was Victor Murphy and David DuBois in that order on the answer.
Thanks.
Question in the room.
I know you touched on this a little bit, but
Question was, what is the current threat of wildfires?
Pardon? Take a minute.
And if we ask the folks on the phone to mute your phones while we do the answer here. The question was, what's the current wildfire threat situation? Do you want to take that?
Yeah,
one?
I'll take it. I'm not. In Texas, at least, the wildfire season is usually February. Start to get the green up and threat. This year, with us being so warm so fast, and quite honestly, so far the wildfire season has been very. So with us already being in late April, I think we're past the climatological peak of the wildfire season. We've had the rapid green up, which inhibited. See, last year was so horrible that a lot of things just got burned to crisp. There's not a whole lot left to burn. And then D, we're moving into the wettest time of the year. So I think, luckily and somewhat surprisingly, the wildfire season in Texas, at least thus far, has been subdued quite a bit. Muted a lot considering how dry it's been. Forward, Mexico, I'll defer to Dave a little bit, but I know New Mexico, they tend to get a lot of lightning strikes, their wildfires, and I think June, July, perhaps, and August, peak wildfire season for New Mexico. Spread is still there, and I'll defer to Dave on that.
We tend to have a lot more fires during the little later, like the May, June time period. Some of the bigger. So the snowpack of really the issue is how quickly it's become. Stations have gotten warmer, and so it's. I would have to look at the I think they're doing fuel surveys, right about this. The threat is there for lightning cause. There's a part of it. There's a lot of more dead trees in some of the areas in which.
David, a question in the back here.
Yes, clinics, I may have got this already, but
Question is West Texas in a bullseye for drought over the next 3 months? Klaus?
No, actually, what I tried to indicate was that the caveat or the thing to remember is that we're in such a severe drought that could have a negative feedback effect that favorable for moisture, that it's not guaranteed that especially compared to last year.
Any other questions on the phone or in the room? Right, hearing none, we'll wrap it up here, and I just want to make 2 quick comments to conclude. Just want to remind folks again, as I said at the beginning, this press conference was streamed as part of the Managing Drought in the Southern Plains webinar series. If folks want to register for that series for announcements of upcoming webinars, they can do so, www.southernclimate.org. And I would also like to mention that Victor's, Dave's, and Klaus's presentations that were given here this morning in Lubbock will be available on drought.gov, www.drought.gov. We do have a regional page on there for the Southern Plains, and we have some part of that website dedicated to these forums that we've been running. And so this Lubbock forum will have their presentations and other information as well, including a forum summary that will be produced. And with that, I think we'll conclude. Thanks everyone for being on the phone and being in the room. There better still be